Hernan Bas's piece, They Can Bring the Curtain Down, combines his interest in male sexuality with performance art during the Dada movement, specifically with the ballet Russe. The 8 images in a paper folio explore a young man's experience behind the curtain and the anxieties that rise from leading a life on stage. When pairing these images with Michael Messner's Becoming 100% Straight, one can see how these portraits of a young performer also serve as metaphors for sexual self-discovery. Bas is not merely portraying the life of a dancer on stage. He not only investigates the worries inherent to performance on a physical stage for dancers, but when looked at metaphorically, also the societal pressure of performing homosexuality when living in a heterosexual and patriarchal world. He describes his work and interest in male adolescence as descended from his own journey in discovering his sexuality, beginning of quote, "The whole idea of fag limbo to me begins with a character or an identity that doesn't quite fit the cliches that one would expect from a young homosexual character." End of quote. Michael A. Messner's Becoming 100% Straight utilizes the idea of performance to describe how heterosexuality is a constructed identity. These ideas of gender and sexuality performance are reminiscent of Foucault's theory of the panopticon, where there is an anonymous force by which society uses to discipline itself. He developed this theory from Jeremy Bentham's design for a prison. From the design aspects of the building, the inhabitants would be unable to distinguish whether or not they were being surveyed. Consequently, occupants would always discipline themselves without the need of a watchman at all times. What Foucault references regarding the effects of the panopticon on society are further explored in Messner's Becoming 100% Straight. He uses his own experiences, memory work, and those from 4 additional men to conduct a sociological experiment and study up on corporate elites in sport, on whiteness, on masculinity, and on heterosexuality. From this experiment, Messner determines that he and the other men who participated were performing heterosexuality as young men rather than being heterosexual, beginning of quote. As young male athletes, heterosexuality and masculinity were not something we were, but something we were doing. End of quote. One of the example stories from Messner's paper seems particularly similar to the message conveyed in Bas's They Can Bring the Curtain Down. Tom Waddle, originally a closeted gay man, describes his interest in dance and why he chose athletics over the art form. Beginning of quote, "Something became obvious to me right away, that male ballet dancers were effeminate. I was totally closeted and very concerned about being male. I wanted to be viewed as male. Otherwise, I would be a dancer today. I wanted the male macho image of an athlete." End of quote. Despite ballet's history as an entirely male art form, during the 20th century and beyond, ballet became a feminine, dainty art, primarily practiced by women. Bas integrates the history of ballet in They Can Bring the Curtain Down to highlight the femininity of his male character. The young man is especially gangly, thin, and positions himself awkwardly, often in constricted positions. He is pictured in the corner of a room or at the side of the stage. The man is never shown actually dancing, on stage, or as a centered portrait. Hernan Bas explains his decision to portray his character in this manner, beginning of quote, "These images in particular are joined by the motif of the curtain, the life of the performer behind the scenes. These are the lives of the understudies, the background performers, rarely in the forefront but essential to the story." End of quote. In this picture performance, Bas's character is closeted behind a curtain and on the side of the stage, looking at the performers on stage. This effect could be seen as a metaphor for the character's homosexuality and how the character would be unable to perform on the heterosexual stage. Because of the character's sexuality, he is incapable of adhering to what Messner references in Adrian Rich terms, the institution of compulsory heterosexuality. The character is literally closeted and put behind the curtain, out of sight. Another way, Hernan Bas also employs the idea of performance as a metaphor for one's internal struggle with his or her sexuality is by his reference to the ballet russe. Bas's decision to choose this particular company is significant because of the history of the Russian ballet. Sergei Diaghilev, the founder of the ballet russe, brought in choreographers to challenge the traditions of ballet. Here is a video of the Rite of Spring. The Rite of Spring proved to be the most controversial, as most of the audience left in the middle of the performance. The music wasn't melodic, but rather consisted of atypical noises such as typewriters and horns. The movement became strikingly aggressive at times, casting away balletic aesthetic lines. This reference to this specific company can be seen as a metaphor for how Bas's character subverts gender expectations through his performance of homosexuality. The young man does not perform in the same manner as the heterosexual world. One can appreciate Hernan Bas's work. They can bring the curtain down without the context of Michael Messner's Becoming 100% Straight for his aesthetically pleasing portraits and historical reference to the Ballet Russe. However, without this article, the viewer potentially loses the ability to see how Bas used his 8 images as a metaphor for the performance of sexuality.